There are moments in Imperial history when a single world forgets its place, when pride swells into defiance, and defiance becomes open flame. A governor whispers treason in the dim glow of a strategium. A planetary militia refuses a tithe order. A cult gathers in the underhive and swears allegiance to something that should never have been named. And somewhere in the void above, a single Imperial Aquila tilts its wings, shadowing a doomed world beneath the weight of the Imperium's absolute judgment. Because rebellion in the grim darkness of the far future is not a political act, it is a death sentence written across continents. And when the last warning vox goes silent, when the final plea dissolves into static, the Imperium delivers the only answer it believes in: the fire that ends worlds, the decree whispered by inquisitors and chapter masters alike, Exterminatus. Before we descend into the abyss of what truly happens when a planet rebels, breathe with the story. And if you want more journeys through the Imperium's darkest truths, you can support this chronicle by liking, sharing, and subscribing. It helps illuminate the corners of a universe built on shadow. The first spark of any planetary rebellion is never the shattering of statues or the raising of stolen weapons. It begins in the smallest crack, the kind whispered rather than carved, a tremor in the breath of an entire world that only those who live close to its surface can feel. On Varnis Prime, it began with the sound of the wind carrying rumors, drifting through manufactorum stacks and hive corridors like dust. Most citizens dismissed it. They always did. The Imperium was eternal, its edicts unquestionable. A world did not rebel. A world bent, bowed, and broke under the weight of its duty, but never rebelled. And so the earliest signs were ignored, resented, or cursed as the idle talk of the tired, the starving, and the disillusioned. Yet even the smallest ember, if neglected, can drift toward Prometheum. The first true sign arrived as a subtle change in the tone of the morning broadcasts. Every dawn, the hive loudspeakers crackled to life, their ancient vox grills humming with the familiar litany of quotas, production targets, and devotional affirmations. But one morning, as the people of Varnis Prime trudged out of their cramped hab blocks, the message contained a brief static hiss, a flicker of distortion so faint most dismissed it as malfunction. Still, a few paused, noting the way the voice seemed unsteady, as if the unseen announcer were forcing each word through clenched teeth. That was when a handful of citizens exchanged glances, just quick, cautious looks, wondering whether something in the system had shifted. But the shift was not mechanical, it was human. In the lower hive, where the air was thick with chemical residue and the walls sweated condensation, a foreman named Rigel Brecht stood over a conveyor belt that had jammed for the third time that shift. His workers, gaunt and pale beneath flickering lumen strips, awaited instruction. Rigel's hand hovered over the stop rune, and for the first time in his decades of service, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of weariness. Weariness so profound it felt like a presence behind him, whispering encouragement to give in, to let the machine fail, to let something fall apart. When he finally pressed the rune, the conveyor groaned back to life, but the hesitation lingered in him like a seed planted deep. If one weary man could fantasize about inaction, so could others. Far above him, in the mid-hive administrative quarters, an Adeptus Administratum clerk named Jessa Marlin scrolled through tithe records on a data slate so old the edges of its runic screen flickered with the faint ghosts of previous entries. She had seen the numbers slipping for weeks, slight reductions in output, inconsistencies in grain reports from agri-sprawls, delays in mineral freighter departures, minor infractions, insignificant on their own, more curious than alarming, but patterns have a voice of their own, and these numbers murmured to her something was wrong, something was beginning. Still, protocol demanded she file each discrepancy as clerical error or local inefficiency, and she did so with the quiet obedience of every functionary trained since childhood to revere order above intuition. But intuition has a way of pressing its fingers deeper each day. When she returned home, she found herself listening to the collisions of distant machinery, sensing a rhythm she had never noticed before, like a heartbeat faltering. The first person to openly comment on the change was a preacher of the local ministorum, Father Celian Darn. He stood in the center of a weather-beaten chapel carved into the remains of an ancient ferrocrete block, preaching to a weary congregation. His voice, normally soft and soothing, carried an edge that day, sharp enough to draw attention even among the half-asleep crowd. He spoke of vigilance, of the emperor's watching gaze, of loyalty that must endure even when the world around them crumbles. The parishioners murmured their responses, but Celian saw doubt buried in their eyes. For the first time, he noticed not only exhaustion in their postures but a simmering unrest, a flicker that had not been there before. It unsettled him, and it unsettled him even more that when he retired to his quarters that night, he felt an unspoken question gnawing at him: what if their doubt had reason? Several districts away, on the outskirts of Hive Vordran, the workers of Foundry Sigma 1-2 had congregated around the cooling stacks, pretending to rest while carefully scanning for enforcers. A rumor had reached them. A supply convoy had been rerouted without explanation. 2 overseers had vanished after reporting a discrepancy in ration allocation, and a Vox message had been intercepted that did not follow any known Administratum encryption pattern. The workers whispered of something being hidden from them, something more dangerous than their usual hardships. One woman, a welder with burn scars across her arms, claimed she had seen Arbites landing craft descending toward the governor's fortress. Her story was met with disbelief at first, but disbelief is fragile when accompanied by fear, and fear spreads quickly. Before long, the Arbites' presence in the hive became impossible to ignore. Black-armored enforcers appeared not only in the key intersections but in markets, hab corridors, and open plazas. They did not announce their purpose, they simply watched. People instinctively avoided their visors, but that avoidance only served to heighten the tension. The Arbites were not there to maintain order, they were there to monitor something. The question was what? The moment that truly broke the illusion of normalcy came not from the Arbites, nor the Administratum, nor the Skitarii patrols that roamed the upper hive. It came from a single outburst in a crowded transit station. A man in tattered work robes threw down his ration pack and shouted that the Emperor had abandoned the world, that the governor had been lying to them, that the tithes were being siphoned off for private enrichment. He screamed until Arbites stormed in, dragging him away. But even as they hauled him through the steel doors, his voice echoed across the station, a desperate, cracking wail that pierced the hearts of those who heard it. It wasn't his words that mattered, it was the fear behind them, a fear they all shared but had never dared give voice to. After that, murmurs began to thread through the hive like tendrils of smoke. Workers exchanged glances instead of greetings. Administratum clerks worked with twitching hands. Ministorum priests spoke with forced conviction. The governor's broadcasts grew more frequent but also more defensive, emphasizing loyalty, discipline, and vigilance with an intensity that bordered on shrill. The populace sensed the desperation in his tone and took it as confirmation of their fears. Authority that sounds afraid is authority on the brink of losing control. In the underhive, where shadows swallowed entire corridors and the moans of long-abandoned ventilation shafts filled the air, the first gatherings took place. Small circles at first, 5 or 10 citizens, meeting beneath dripping pipes to share stories that might have been lies or truths, or fabrications born of exhaustion. But numbers swelled quickly. The underhive had always been a crucible for discontent, but now the discontent had purpose. It had shape, it had direction. Soon, unnamed factions began forming, their identities shifting with every meeting but their intent unchanging. Something was wrong with the world, and if the Imperium would not fix it, then they must. Meanwhile, in the governor's palace, Governor Halbrecht Voss stood before a hololithic projection of the hive stacks, his face pale under the flickering blue light. His advisors insisted the disturbances were minor. They urged him not to overreact. They begged him to maintain the facade of control. But Voss, unlike his subordinates, had access to reports far more alarming. He knew shipments had been delayed not by accident but by sabotage. He knew the Arbites had intercepted a coded communique addressed to a known heretic cell. He knew the Adeptus Mechanicus enclave had registered a spike in unauthorized power transfers deep beneath Hive Vordran. And worst of all, he knew that an inquisitorial cipher had appeared in his incoming message queue, demanding immediate compliance and providing no details. A planet does not rebel in dramatic fashion. A planet rebels like a man dying of hypoxia, gasping, stumbling, twitching toward its end, long before the final collapse. Voss sensed that collapse approaching. It loomed like a storm beyond the horizon, visible only to those positioned high enough to see the world's full picture. On the ground, however, the rebellion still felt like a rumor. The citizens continued their routines, working, praying, eating, collapsing into sleep, while a quiet dread rippled beneath their interactions. Children played in alleys, their laughter strained. Merchants sold wares while glancing nervously at the sky. Enforcers patrolled with increasing rigidity, their movements sharp enough to betray their rising unease. The refusal came next. It happened in the agri-sprawl of Calyx fields, where a regiment of workers collectively declined to board their transport loaders. The foreman threatened punishment. The local militia arrived in armored crawlers. But the workers remained still, their faces gaunt, their expressions blank. They would not sow another hectare until they received answers regarding ration shortages and missing family members. The standoff lasted only minutes before militia officers opened fire. When the smoke cleared, 23 workers lay dead, and with their deaths, something irreversible shifted across Varnis Prime. News of the massacre spread through the hives faster than any sanctioned broadcast. It was carried by trembling voices, by scribbled notes passed in drinking halls, by whispered confessions in confessional booths. Every retelling grew more vivid, more gruesome, more compelling. People who had once bitten their tongues now clenched their fists. The Arbites doubled their patrols, but doubling was not enough. Whispers now roared behind closed doors. The administratum clerk Jessa Marlin walked home one evening and noticed Imperial Aquila banners torn from the walls. Father Celian found his chapel door vandalized with symbols he dared not name. Rigel Brecht, the weary foreman, discovered an entire shift of workers had not arrived for duty. Something was happening, something vast, invisible, and inevitable. Above the world, aboard the orbiting frigate Veritas Ab Solum, the inquisitorial cipher finally unfolded into a message. Its contents were brief. The planet was under scrutiny. The slightest deviation from Imperial compliance would trigger immediate escalation. Governor Voss stared at the message for a long time, sweat dripping down his temples. An inquisitor did not warn unless they already suspected, and when suspicion settled on a planet, history recorded only one direction. Down on the streets, as night fell, and hive spires blinked like dying embers, the first open act of rebellion finally erupted. It happened in the Manufactorum district, where a crowd of hundreds clashed with enforcers after a young woman was detained for defying a curfew order. The confrontation spiraled into chaos. Flame belchers roared, vox horns shattered, the air tasted of promethium and metal, and somewhere in the smoke, someone unfurled a banner devoid of the Imperial Aquila. That moment broke the world, not because a banner was raised, but because it was witnessed, and once witnessed, it could never be undone. The first spark had become flame, and Varnis Prime unknowingly, unwillingly had taken its first irrevocable step toward the word whispered across a million doomed worlds: rebellion. And above it all, in the calm, cold silence of orbit, a single inquisitorial vessel adjusted its course, aligning its sensors toward the rising fire below, watching with a patience older than the world itself. For once rebellion begins, the Emperor's gaze always follows. When a planet rebels, even in small tremors and hushed exchanges, there comes a moment when the Imperium notices. Not quickly, not with agility, but with the slow, monumental certainty of a continent shifting its weight. On Varnis Prime, that moment arrived not with a proclamation, but with a question, one so simple it should have been harmless, yet it hung like a blade above the governor's head. The Adeptus Administratum asked for clarification. A single message, a single line. Explain the deviations. For most worlds, these words amounted to nothing more than bureaucratic formality. But Governor Hulbrecht Voss knew they were the first note of a dirge. He read them at his command lectern, surrounded by advisors who mistook the tremor in his hand for mere exhaustion. They never saw the fear behind his eyes, the calculation already forming, as he realized that acknowledging the deviations would be an admission of failure, and denying them would be a lie the Administratum could easily disprove. Either course opened a door he wished remained sealed. He sent a reply. A carefully crafted reassurance filled with excuses about equipment malfunctions, local unrest caused by seasonal supply shortages, minor clerical misallocations, all typical explanations for worlds stretched thin by burdens no mortal empire should demand. But even as he transmitted the report, Voss knew it was meaningless. When the Administratum asked a question, it already possessed the answer. That understanding weighed on him like the gravity of a dying star. Atop the spires of High Vordran, the Arbites' precinct fortress rotated from a posture of vigilance to one of scrutiny. The judge-marshals received encrypted orders from orbit, stamped with an Administratum seal so ornate it shimmered across their helm lenses. The message was concise. Establish compliance monitoring procedures, increase census-level tracking, detain potential agitators for interrogation. In the fortress chapel, where icons of imperial law glowed dimly beneath suspended incenses, the Arbites recited their oaths with the clipped discipline of warriors preparing for escalation. Within hours, checkpoints multiplied like metallic tumors across key junctions. Citizens found themselves halted on their way to work, probed for identification, interrogated for inconsistencies they did not understand. The Arbites never raised their voices. They did not need to. Their silence held more weight than threats, as if judgment itself had taken shape and walked among the people. For those with nothing to hide, the scrutiny was suffocating. For those who had whispered even the faintest syllable of doubt, it was terror distilled. Meanwhile, in the lower hive, whispers responded to pressure with more whispers. People moved more cautiously, but they moved. Rebellion does not thrive on open defiance alone. It feeds on fear as much as fury. As Arbites' patrols intensified, citizens huddled in shuttered rooms, sharing rumors of disappearances. Whole families taken in the night. A manufactorum shift marched away and never returned. A cleric dragged from the altar mid-sermon, accused of spreading suspicion against the planetary authorities. Father Celian Darn was not dragged away, but he knew his turn might come. He knelt before the votive candles in his chapel, their flickering flames casting thin shadows across the cracked floor. The air smelled of old incense and faint mold. He clasped his rosarius and whispered prayers for clarity, but clarity did not come. Instead, he found his thoughts tangled with the same forbidden question the people asked. Had the Emperor's gaze truly turned toward Varnis Prime? And if so, what had he seen? Far above the hive's choking smog layer, aboard the Administratum ship Lex Imperialis, senior scribe Marielle Thade reviewed the planet's data streams. The numbers told a story that troubled her, though she would never voice concern aloud. The deviations were not random. They were coordinated, patterns spread across districts separated by kilometers of ferrocrete and decades of social division. Production quotas missed with identical percentage gaps. Shipment discrepancies aligned with ritual precision. Communications glitches occurred simultaneously across disparate sectors. Marielle Thade had spent her life deciphering the silent language of worlds, and this one spoke a single word beneath its data: intent. She logged her findings, and when she did, her quill pen flickered with a crimson sigil, a mark indicating her report had been flagged for inquisitorial review. She froze, breath shallow. The Inquisition had taken interest. Below, the populace felt the shift without ever seeing the sigil. It manifested in subtle tremors, increased Adeptus Arbites' presence, off-world vessels blocking trade routes, Administratum demands for more detailed logs, even the occasional black-clad figure wandering among enforcer formations, their armor free of insignia save for a blank rosette emblem etched with faint silver lines. People noticed. People always notice rosettes, even when they pretend they do not. Governor Voss felt the pressure most acutely. He moved through his fortress palace in restless circuits, his footsteps echoing through gilded halls that once symbolized his authority, but now felt like corridors of judgment. His advisors urged calm, but their assurances rang hollow. He could feel the Imperium's eye upon him, cold and unblinking. For decades he had ruled with strict adherence to imperial doctrine. For decades he had sacrificed everything for compliance. Now his world slipped from his grip like sand, and the Imperium poised to crush it entirely for a crime it had not yet fully committed. But the Imperium did not need full commitment. Suspicion alone was enough to trigger the shift from scrutiny to response. That response came when the first Arbites raid targeted the underhive dens where agitators met. It was efficient, devastating, and merciless. Dozens died, hundreds were dragged to holding cells, and yet despite the brutality, something worse emerged from the ashes of the raid: unity. Groups that once despised one another suddenly shared a common enemy. It was as if the Arbites' intervention forged an alliance the agitators themselves had been too fragmented to create. In the ruins of a burned-out drinking hall, a former miner named Kellen Hearth addressed a cluster of survivors. His voice was raw, cracked from inhaling smoke, but the fire behind it was unmistakable. He spoke of the massacre at Calyx Fields, of the ration shortages, of arrests made without cause. He recounted tales of the Arbites raiding not agitators' gatherings but children's shelters, claiming they harbored subversive material. The listeners leaned in, trembling between fear and fury. Kellen promised them that unity was the only path to survival. And though no one dared say the word rebellion, it was the only word on every tongue. As the hive fomented unrest, the upper echelons of the Imperium turned their tools toward deeper investigation. The Adeptus Mechanicus enclave on Varnis Prime detected unauthorized power surges within the hive's subterranean conduits. Their Skitarii patrols marched into the lower districts, red optics glowing like suspended coals as they traced illegal power siphons. The cultists who had installed them fled deeper underground, disappearing into tunnels older than the planet's recorded history. The Skitarii reported anomalies in the readings too organized, too deliberate to be the work of local rebels. The information reached Governor Voss, who forwarded it to the Administratum, who forwarded it to the inquisitorial vessel circling in orbit. Nothing on Varnis Prime was truly hidden anymore. In the hive, every citizen sensed the tightening grip. Children stopped playing openly in the streets. Vendors watched every passing enforcer with a mixture of dread and defiance. Even the wind felt different, as if it carried ash from future fires. Each night, the curfew sirens wailed through the darkness, echoing off metallic walls like the howl of a wounded beast. The Arbites fortified their precincts, setting up additional Vox towers and surveillance arrays. Patrols doubled, then tripled. The civilians of Varnis Prime found themselves living beneath the shadow of constant evaluation. Every word spoken in public felt dangerous, every gesture carried weight. The hives, once noisy with the hum of machinery and the chatter of millions, fell eerily quiet in the curfew hours. It was in this suffocating stillness that the first unmistakable sign of inquisitorial involvement appeared. A black shuttle descended from orbit, its hull etched with faint ceramite filigree. It docked at the governor's palace with a hiss of venting atmosphere. Aboard it stood a single figure, Inquisitor Chiron Hale of the Ordo Hereticus. He stepped down the ramp with the deliberate calm of a man accustomed to delivering judgment. The palace guards straightened instinctively, their weapons lowered, but hands tense. Voss bowed deeply, feeling sweat gather under his collar. Hale observed him with pale, unreadable eyes, not judgmental, not cruel, simply analytical, as though assessing the structural integrity of a failing building. "Governor Voss," the Inquisitor said, his voice low but resonant, "your world is under examination." Voss swallowed. His voice nearly broke as he replied, "I will assist in any way the Imperium requires." Inquisitor Hale stepped past him, boots clicking softly against polished stone. His retinue followed silent acolytes, data savants, and a servo skull that drifted like a spectre. The presence of these figures within the palace signaled something far worse than planetary unrest. It meant the Imperium no longer viewed Varnis Prime as merely inefficient. It viewed the world as potentially compromised. From that moment on, nothing unfolded without Hale's knowledge. The Inquisitor requested access to Administratum records, Mechanicus data logs, Arbites arrest reports, astropathic communications, and planetary defense records. He cross-referenced patterns, analyzed timestamps, and ordered interrogations. More than once, Voss heard screams echo through the palace's stone corridors as detainees were encouraged to reveal what they knew. And while Hale worked, the rebels did too. In the underhive, Kellenharth and his followers found themselves swelling with numbers. Hundreds joined them after the Arbites raids, then thousands. They established hidden routes through forgotten tunnels. They seized abandoned filtration plants to hide their gatherings. They constructed crude weapons and used stolen data slates to coordinate new acts of sabotage. Most of the time, they were disorganized, but desperation can forge a semblance of strategy. Meanwhile, the Adeptus Mechanicus discovered that power surges were not mere theft. They were coordinated draws on hive infrastructure, likely preparing for something large, something catastrophic. The tech priests informed the Inquisitor, who tightened his net further. Tension rose like a tide. Rigel Brecht, the weary foreman, watched his workers arrive in silence each morning, their eyes dull, their movements mechanical. He could sense the simmering resentment beneath their exhaustion. He tried to maintain order, issuing commands with feigned confidence, but he knew his authority meant little now. When one worker refused to operate a malfunctioning cutter, citing safety concerns, Rigel understood the truth. Fear no longer kept the hives obedient. In the chapel, Father Celian sensed his sermons losing their power. Devotion had not left them, fear had simply devoured it. People sought him for reassurance, but what comfort could he give? He himself no longer slept through the night. Each time he closed his eyes, he imagined Arbites descending upon his chapel, tearing him from the pulpit, accusing him of inciting rebellion. Perhaps they would not be wrong. Above the world, Inquisitor Hale completed his analysis. He summoned Governor Voss to the Strategium, its hololithic projections casting ghostly blue reflections across the chamber. Hale spoke without flourish, without anger, without sympathy. Your world is disintegrating, Governor. The question is no longer whether rebellion exists, it is whether it can be contained. Voss's throat tightened. With respect, Inquisitor, I still believe. Hale raised a gloved hand, silencing him. You believe because you must. But belief does not alter outcome. Conditions have escalated beyond the threshold. Voss felt the floor tilt beneath him. Threshold. He knew what that meant. He had heard the whispers. He had read the forbidden texts. A planet that crossed the threshold was no longer viewed as salvageable. It was viewed as potential infection. Your duty, Hale continued, is to maintain order until higher authorities deliver their judgment. A chill ran through Voss's bones. Judgment. Down in the hives, unrest reached a fever pitch. Explosions rocked a transit hub. A manufactorum district went dark for 6 hours. A Skitari patrol was ambushed in the underhive and wiped out entirely. The Arbites responded with force so overwhelming it flattened 3 blocks, and yet unrest continued to spread, as if every act of imperial retaliation fed the fire instead of quenching it. The Emperor's gaze had fully turned toward Varnis Prime, and in its cold light, nothing, not the loyal, not the fearful, not even the governor himself could escape scrutiny. The planet was no longer a world, it was a case file, a diagnosis, a verdict waiting to be written. And far beyond the hive walls, in the orbiting void, entire fleets adjusted their positions as the Imperium prepared for the next stage. A stage from which there was no return. When rebellion finally declared itself on Varnis Prime, it did not erupt in a single thunderous moment. Instead, it seeped like oil through fractured stone, filling every crack of the hive with dark promise. The first true riot ignited on the 17th level of the mid-hive, when Arbites troopers attempted to detain a young manufactorum worker on suspicion of distributing seditious chants. His mother refused to let them take him. His neighbors joined her. Soon, the entire hab block thrummed with a feverish pulse as thousands of voices rose in defiance. Clubs met shields, fists met shock batons, and a cascade of violence spilled outward with unstoppable momentum. Arbite sirens wailed like the death cries of some iron beast as reinforcements thundered in, but they were too late. The riot erupted on multiple levels simultaneously. Word of the confrontation spread through Vox channels the Arbites had never realized existed. Makeshift communicators woven from stolen parts, slaved into old emergency lines. Someone had planned this. Someone had taken the raw energy of unrest and shaped it into a weapon. Governor Voss, watched reports flood the strategium in a frantic procession of hololithic red. District after district entered revolt protocols. The hive's population, a number so vast it could not be meaningfully imagined, had awakened as if under a shared impulse. Voss gripped the podium until his knuckles whitened, his breath uneven. He felt like a man caught in the teeth of a machine he had once believed he controlled. "Inquisitor Hale must be informed," he said. But the Vox adept responded that Hale already knew. The Inquisitor was moving on his own. Hale stepped from the shadows as if summoned by Voss's fear. His expression remained unchanged as he surveyed the hololithic chaos. He spoke in a voice that cut through the panicked murmurs of the room like a scalpel. "This is no longer a matter of civic unrest. This is insurrection," the word rang out, with the force of a sentence. Outside, the riots swelled into a tide. Barricades of scrap metal and broken hab furnishings rose across major thoroughfares. Civilians, armed with tools, pipes, mining cutters, anything they could hold, surged into open squares. The Arbites fought them with shock mauls and suppression shields, firing rubberized rounds until their barrels glowed. But no amount of force could stem a population that had already passed the threshold of fear. Rage had replaced dread, and the hive itself became a crucible. Rigel Brecht found himself swept into the chaos when his entire shift refused orders. He tried to impose calm, shouting above the din, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of bodies pushing past him. A co-worker he had known for years shoved a makeshift spear into his hands and told him to fight for their lives. Rigel shook his head, dazed. He had never thought of himself as a rebel. He was a worker, nothing more. But as Arbites descended into the manufactorum floor, firing shock rounds without distinction, something in him broke in a clean, decisive snap. He swung the spear. Father Celion heard the riots before he saw them. From the steps of his chapel, he watched smoke curl from distant levels below like ghostly fingers. Gunfire echoed through the passageways. Devotees rushed past him, seeking shelter inside the chapel's fading sanctity. Celion tried to calm them, but the air was charged with panic. A woman clutched her child, both trembling. A man held a bleeding arm, his eyes wild. Celion's heart pounded with a mix of dread and responsibility. Should he hide them? Should he turn them away? Did sheltering rebels count as sedition? Was allowing them to die a betrayal of his calling? He prayed for guidance. None came. Instead, he heard the unmistakable sound of Arbites' boots charging down the street, followed by the bellow of a crowd rising to meet them. Celion closed the chapel doors, feeling the ancient wood shudder as chaos surged outside. In the underhive, Kellen Hearth saw the riots as confirmation proof that the world had reached its breaking point. Yet even he had not expected such scale. Thousands swarmed the gutters and tunnels, chanting for freedom, for vengeance, for survival. Kellen stood atop a rusted ventilation duct, shouting orders that echoed through the cavernous depths. Fighters formed into loose squads. Scouts spread through hidden passages. Saboteurs prepared promethium charges. Their eyes burned with purpose. But purpose was not strategy. Kellen knew they faced an adversary beyond their understanding. The Imperium did not crush riots. It eradicated insurrections. And once the Inquisition deemed a world compromised, its fate narrowed to a grim, familiar path. That path began with control of communication. High above the chaos, aboard the orbiting vessel Lex Imperialis, astropathic choirs keened as they transmitted encrypted signals to Sector Command. Their blind, scarred faces remained serene, even as blood trickled from their nostrils. The messages carried Hale's initial assessment. Insurrection confirmed. Potential heretical influence suspected. Request immediate escalation protocols. The astropaths did not know what the escalation meant. The scribe receiving their transmissions did. And when she stamped the message with the proper seal, she felt the same cold dread that Governor Voss tasted in every breath. The next stage had begun. The militarization phase. Adeptus Arbites precincts across the hive activated contingency procedures. Riot gear transitioned to execution gear. Armored carriers rumbled from reinforced gates. Heavy bolters were mounted on rooftops. Retributor platforms rose from armored cradles like mechanical saints of judgment. Civilians scattered as Arbites began deploying lethal rounds with sanctioned precision. Their orders were no longer to pacify, now they were to suppress. Governor Voss watched his world burn in real time. Smoke twisted in plumes across the horizon. Reports streamed in of Arbites casualties. Mechanicus enclaves breached, supply lines severed. He had long believed that loyalty and order defined his rule. But now he saw the truth. He had never been in control. He had only been tolerated, and tolerance was a fragile gift. Inquisitor Hale moved through the palace with deliberate calm, offering no sympathy, no rage, no hesitation. He questioned captives personally, extracting confessions like a surgeon excising rot. He studied rebel communications, noting patterns of coordination that troubled him. Too organized, too synchronized, too effective. This level of coordination implies external influence, Hale muttered to himself as he reviewed data streams. Possibly chaos cult infiltration, possibly Xenos interference, possibly homegrown treachery. He spoke each possibility without judgment. To an inquisitor, every possibility was already guilty. In the Manufactorum sector, the riots escalated into a full siege. Rigel found himself fighting alongside people he barely knew, hurling debris at Arbites' lines while gunfire cracked overhead. He felt the splatter of warm blood. He did not know if it came from him or someone else. A trooper raised a shock maul toward him, but Rigel swung first, pushing the man backward. A worker beside him detonated a charge that blew apart an armored carrier. The crowd roared with a sound that was equal parts triumph and despair. Rigel realized he had crossed a line he could never retreat from. Father Celian heard the crackdown spreading. The chapel walls trembled with detonations. Through stained glass windows, he glimpsed plumes of fire illuminating the dim hive. His congregation huddled in fear, begging for guidance. Celian opened his mouth to offer comfort, but found only silence. He felt sick with helplessness. He no longer knew whether the Emperor watched them with mercy or judgment. Then, as if in answer, the chapel doors burst open. A squad of Arbites stormed inside, weapons raised. Celian felt his heart freeze, but instead of seizing him, they ordered the civilians to the floor and secured the chapel as a fortified position. They claimed it was necessary for hive stability. Celion's sanctuary had been seized, his holy place turned into a battlefield redoubt. He watched the Arbites set up firing lanes between pews, trampling icons underfoot without a second thought. The Emperor's house had become an armory of fear. In the Underhive, Kellen Hearth received word of the crackdown. He knew the Arbites would sweep downward soon, and he rallied his followers with a speech that echoed through the labyrinthine tunnels. He spoke of justice, survival, and unity. He promised they had a chance to win. Even as he spoke the words, he knew they were a lie. No world wins against the Imperium. Far above the hive, Inquisitor Hale made his final assessment. He stood in the strategium, surrounded by data feeds, orbital, scans, and casualty projections. The numbers were not merely grim, they were damning. The hive was no longer salvageable by conventional means. Even if Arbites regained control, the ideological infection would persist. The rebellion had grown too large. It had turned from protest to insurgency, from insurgency to war. Hale spoke softly, almost reverently. The situation has escalated beyond planetary capacity for containment. Governor Voss felt the words as though they were bullets lodged in his chest. Inquisitor, he whispered, there must be another option. Hale turned toward him. His pale eyes held no anger, only the gravity of a man fulfilling duty. There is one option, he said, but not the one you seek. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Voss knew that once an Inquisitor reached this point, his authority eclipsed all others on the world. Not even a planetary governor could challenge his mandate. Hale now held the fate of Varnis Prime in his hands. In the streets, Arbites and rebels clashed in relentless waves. Each district fell into a cycle of siege, capture, recapture, and collapse. Prometheum fires spread unchecked. Civilians fled in every direction, but no direction led to safety. The hive was dying, and the Imperium had begun to prepare for the next, unspoken step. At dawn, if dawn existed in the artificial cycles of the hive, Inquisitor Hale transmitted a signal, a secure, classified code meant only for specific vessels orbiting the planet. Moments later, The sky over Varnis Prime shimmered as several ships shifted position. They did not fire, they did not speak, they merely waited. The population of Varnis felt a pressure settle over the world, though none could explain why. It was the sensation of standing in the shadow of an executioner's raised blade. Down in the bowels of the underhive, Kellen Hearth paused mid-stride as a tremor ran through the metal beneath his feet. He stared upward, sensing something immense and terrible settling itself into place. Father Celion clutched his rosarius, whispering prayers that trembled with dread. He felt as though some colossal decision had been made far above him, beyond the reach of mortal pleas. Rigel wiped blood from his face and felt a sudden weight press into his lungs, as if the air itself knew what was coming. Governor Voss stood in the strategium, unable to speak, unable to breathe, as Inquisitor Hale finished typing a sequence of codes into the Vox array. When the final sigil glowed red, Hale turned toward Voss with solemn finality. "The Imperium has deemed your world compromised," he said. "The cleansing protocols are in motion." Voss felt his knees weaken. Are you saying there will be Exterminatus?" Hale's expression did not change. "That decision lies above even me, but the mechanism is prepared." The governor covered his mouth, horror swallowing his words. Across the world, amid riots and fire and broken faith, millions of people felt the shift without knowing its name. It was the moment a planet ceases to be a home and becomes a liability the Imperium might choose to erase forever. The air of Varnis Prime changed the moment the orbital vessels aligned into their silent vigil. It was not a physical shift, no tremor cracked the metal bones of the hive, no Vox announcement heralded doom, yet every living soul felt some unseen line snap. Rumors rippled through the riots, whispered in panicked breaths between volleys of gunfire. Something was coming, something worse than Arbites, worse than starvation, worse than rebellion. High in the palace, Governor Voss struggled to understand the enormity of the threat Inquisitor Hale had invoked. Exterminatus was a word spoken only in hushed tones, a destroyer of worlds, a judgment so final that even its invocation felt sacrilegious. He paced the strategium as the hololithic displays flickered with casualty counts and burning districts. Missions of Arbites flickered out of existence in hostile red as they were overwhelmed. The hive was no longer merely a city in revolt. It was a battlefield soaked in desperation, and Hale seemed to believe there was no path back. Yet Voss clung to hope like a drowning man clutching driftwood. He had not requested this fate. He had not sanctioned this rebellion. He refused to let his world die because of circumstances he had never fully grasped. He believed foolishly, perhaps, that there must still be some corner of order he could salvage. "Inquisitor," he said, approaching Hale, "if we can retake the lower districts, if the Arbites can re-establish a perimeter." Hale cut him off with a gesture. "Governor, the hive has passed the threshold of recoverability. Your Arbites are overwhelmed. The population is ideologically compromised. The rebels are multiplying faster than they can be slain." Voss swallowed hard. "But surely," Hale's eyes hardened slightly, "the Imperium does not gamble with contagion, whether it comes from heresy, Xenos taint, or runaway civil collapse. Corruption spreads, and when it spreads unchecked, Exterminatus becomes unchecked. Mercy." The word hung between them like a death knell. Voss realized then that Hale had not come to reason. He had come to witness, to evaluate, and if necessary, to condemn. Far below, in the underhive, Kellen Hearth felt the gravity of the world's turning fate, even though he did not know its name. His makeshift headquarters and abandoned rail switchyard shuddered with the rumble of distant detonations. Runners arrived with frantic news of Arbites advancing through choke points, and others reported civilians screaming about ships in the sky. But the strangest reports came from those who'd climbed high vantage points in the mid-hive. They claimed the heavens were brightening with unnatural light. The orbital fleet was aligning. Kellen rubbed his temples, pacing between discarded crates. He had known the Imperium's response would be brutal, but he had hoped it would be containable. He had spread fear to unify the people, not to doom them. Now, even his most fervent fighters looked shaken. They asked him whether they ought to flee deeper into the hive or press upward to seize control of the power grid. Neither option seemed meaningful anymore. He wished he had answers. Father Celian moved quietly through the chapel, turned fortress as civilians huddled together in scared silence. Arbites occupied firing positions behind overturned pews, muttering into their vox beads, scanning the streets outside for signs of rebel movement. Celian's robes were torn, his rosarius cracked, yet he forced himself to act with calm, offering prayers to the terrified families sheltering beside toppled statues of saints. He no longer knew if his words comforted anyone. He doubted if they even comforted him, but he kept speaking them, because silence felt like surrender. A bolt of light flashed through a stained glass window, not from the street but from above. It shimmered in a color Celian could not place, like a reflection from something impossibly distant yet unbearably close. He felt a chill crawl across his spine. "What was that?" one Arbites officer muttered. Celian didn't answer. He didn't know. Rigel Brecht, blood-smeared and exhausted, ducked behind a shattered conveyor machine as Arbites fired suppression rounds down the Manufactorum corridor. He had lost count of the hours since the riots began. His throat burned from smoke and shouting. His hands trembled from adrenaline and exhaustion. But most of all, his mind buzzed with the growing awareness that everything around him was spiraling toward a conclusion he couldn't comprehend. A young woman beside him, one of the workers from Section 14C, grabbed his sleeve. "Rigel," she gasped. "The skies are wrong." He frowned. "What do you mean, wrong?" "I looked out a ventilation shaft when I ran here. The ships, they're not moving, not like normal. They're watching." Rigel's stomach knotted. He had heard stories whispered in the Manufactorum dormitories, stories about how some worlds ended, about what it meant when the sky filled with silent warships. Nobody spoke the name aloud. It was a curse, a nightmare, a myth so terrible workers would spit on the floor to ward off its mention. But he couldn't stop himself from thinking it now. Not Exterminatus, not here. In the palace, Governor Voss made one last desperate attempt to save his planet. He gathered his senior advisors, those still alive, and proposed a full surrender to the Inquisition. He would hand Kellen Hearth over himself. He would round up rebel leadership. He would personally offer reparations, anything to demonstrate compliance. But Hale dismissed the idea without hesitation. The Imperium does not negotiate with corruption. Compliance is not enough to erase ideological contagion. Voss slammed his fists on the table. "We are not traitors. You cannot condemn an entire world because of a rebellion we did not authorize." Hale's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Governor, the Imperium does not condemn worlds because they are traitors. It condemns worlds to prevent more traitors." Voss felt sick. His advisors stared at him, waiting for some last miracle command. But he had none left. In the underhive, Kellen Hearth watched as a group of children wandered into the switchyard, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes wide with terror. They had been separated from their families during the riots, and now they sought refuge among rebels who barely had enough supplies for themselves. Kellen's chest tightened. He knelt beside them, brushing ash from one girl's cheek. "Where are your parents?" he asked softly. They were taken," she whispered. "By rebels?" he asked. She shook her head. "By Arbites." Kellen clenched his jaw. He felt rage burning in him, but beneath it was fear. Fear that no amount of defiance would protect these children from what was coming. He wanted to promise safety, but he tasted the lie before it formed. Instead, he whispered, "Stay close. Whatever comes, you stay with us." The girl nodded. Far above, aboard the battleship Vigilant Spirit, a tech priest monitored the alignment of cyclonic torpedo arrays. He chanted Binharic hymns as targeting augers locked onto planetary coordinates. His voice was calm, cold, mechanical. He did not consider the weight of his actions. He did not need to. The Inquisition's authorization code had already opened the pathway to protocol preparation. Only one command remained, one final clearance. It had not yet been given, but the vessels were ready. In the hive, a storm of dread gathered like a physical force. Civilians whispered about the brightening sky. Arbites looked up between engagements and felt their blood run cold. Rebels froze mid-argument when the ground vibrated in a strange, resonant hum that seemed to echo from the heavens. Rumors raced through the tunnels. "The Inquisition is preparing something. We're all dead. They're going to purge the whole world. Run, hide, Pray. Rigel heard the whispers. Father Celian felt them in the prayers of terrified refugees. Kellen sensed them in the widening eyes of his followers. Voss saw them confirmed in Hale's unyielding poise. At last, Voss could bear it no longer. "If you mean to destroy us," he said hoarsely, "why have you not given the final order?" Hale studied him a moment. "Because I am still searching," he said. "For a reason not to." Voss blinked. Hope flared, faint but real. Hale noticed it. "Do not misunderstand," Hale added. "I do not search because I believe your world is innocent. I search because annihilating an entire planet is a weight even an inquisitor must justify in the eyes of the Emperor." Voss felt the last warmth leave him. Hope had been a misinterpretation. Hale was not looking for salvation. He was looking for certainty. Chaos of battle intensified. Rigel fought beside rebels even as doubts gnawed at him. Father Celian watched Arbites firing from the chapel's doors while he tried to comfort the dying. Kellen's fighters clashed with armored troopers in the choking smoke of the lower duct, and overhead, the silent fleet waited. The rebellion surged into one final, desperate crescendo at the central transit nexus, a massive cathedral-like transit hub where mid-hive corridors intersected in a labyrinth of walkways and machinery. Thousands flooded the area in a violent, scrambling tide. It was as though every remaining thread of conflict converged on this single point. Arbites attempted to form a defensive cordon. Rebels stormed the mezzanine levels. Civilians trapped between factions screamed for mercy. The air filled with shot, flame, and the thunderous clang of metal on armor. Kellen Hearth reached the nexus with his fighters, trying to carve a path toward the control tower. He believed wrongly that seizing it might give them leverage. Rigel, stumbling through the carnage, recognized Kellen from rebel broadcasts and charged toward him. Celion arrived moments later, having been pushed along with fleeing refugees as the chapel fell. The three men found themselves drawn together, as if fate had arranged a confrontation. Rigel glared at Kellen. "This is your fault," Kellen spat back. "This was happening long before I lifted a finger." Celian stepped between them, raising his hands. "Stop this. You're fighting each other while the sky prepares to kill us all." Their outbursts were swallowed as a deafening sound echoed through the nexus, a resonant hum, like the groaning of a vast machine awakening. Every eye lifted. Above the hive ceiling, through cracks and apertures, a single lance of brilliant light pierced the clouds. Hale had not given the final command, but something in orbit had shifted. A prelude, a warning. The light vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the meaning was clear. The Imperium was demonstrating its readiness. Father Celian fell to his knees, whispering frantic prayers. Rigel stared upward, shaking. Kellen clenched his teeth, fists trembling. Above, the fleet entered the last phase of alignment. In the palace, Governor Voss collapsed into a chair, trembling with dread as Hale observed the signal from orbit. "Consider this," Hale said quietly. "Your world's final vigil." Hale's expression remained untouched by emotion. "The Emperor now awaits your planet's justification for continued existence." And Voss realized with horror that the next hours would determine whether Varnis Prime would live or become another lifeless ember in the sun. Void. The void above the dying world was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if the stars themselves were holding their breath. The fleet had ceased all motion hours before, arranging itself into a solemn constellation of steel that glimmered against the black. Not a single thruster flickered, not a single gun emplacement rotated. It was the stillness of a ritual, the poised silence before a sword falls. High aboard the command bridge of the strike cruiser Vigilant Resolve, the last of the strategic hololiths were dimmed, leaving the chamber washed in cold lumen light. No one spoke. No one dared break the hush that pressed against every throat. It was the hour of Exterminatus, a moment so absolute that even the seasoned officers felt as if they were standing on the edge of some ancient precipice, peering down into the memory of 1,000 burned worlds. Below them, the planet once known as Illyria 7 rotated with wounded grace. Its continents were scarred from weeks of bombardment, cratered like a broken skull, lit by the faint glow of fires that had taken root in the ruins of its cities. Storms of ash swirled above its equator, turning the upper atmosphere into a roiling smear of poisoned gray. From orbit it looked less like a world and more like an autopsy in progress, its lifeblood leaking into space in ribbons of glowing debris. And yet, there were still pockets of resistance deep in its ravaged heart. Heretics still fought on, cult leaders still poured poison into Vox channels. Entire hab blocks chanted the profane names of their chosen gods. The planet was alive enough to defy its sentence, alive enough to require total purification. At the center of the bridge stood Inquisitor Elrin Voss, armored in matte black, the sigils of the Ordo Hereticus etched into the plates like scars. His presence sent a chill through the air. He did not pace, did not tremble, did not allow even the small betrayals of breath to reveal doubt. He simply stood with hands folded. Behind him, as if he were an observer of something inevitable, his warship, the Vigilant Resolve, belonged to the Death Watch, yet for this moment it was his cathedral, his tribunal, and his executioner's platform. The decision had been sanctioned by the High Lords, affirmed by the Adeptus Ministorum, and supported by every command echelon that had tasted the corruption that seeped through Illyria 7 like a spreading wound. A quiet hiss broke the silence as Magos Ordinatus Rel descended into the command dais, his robes parting like severed smoke. Mechadendrites clicked softly as he transmitted encrypted sequences into the ship's systems. With each confirmation rune that glowed red, another safeguard fell away. In any other circumstance, removing such locks would require half a dozen seals and a choir of tech priests chanting Binharic litanies. But Exterminatus bypassed normal procedure. Exterminatus was its own protocol, its own liturgy. At the far end of the bridge, Brother Captain Hadriel of the Death Watch stood beside the weapon control lectern, his helm held beneath one arm, his expression carved from stone. He was a space marine forged for hunting nightmares, yet even he looked older under the sterile light. To unleash cyclonic torpedoes upon a world even a damned one carried a weight that no battlefield ever could. Marines were born for combat, for glorious death, for standing unmoved against impossible odds. But Exterminatus was different. It was not a battle, it was an ending. Hadriel's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet enough to be mistaken for the sigh of an air vent. Weapon decks report readiness, payloads are stable, firing augurs aligned. Final confirmation, Voss said, turning only slightly. Is the verdict uncontested? Uncontested, Rel answered, his vox tone a mechanical whisper. Contagion analysis indicates irreversible corruption. Spread vectors already beyond planetary containment. Uncontested, Hadriel echoed, though the words carried a somber weight. Surviving defenders have withdrawn to their strongholds. A ground evacuation is impossible. From the shadows near the rear of the bridge, a soft clatter of chains announced the presence of the penitents, hooded figures marked with glyphs of failure, each bearing a data slate chronicling the planet's descent. They were the remnants of Illyria Zeven's own government, bureaucrats, officers, a former planetary minister whose shaking hands clutched a slate that glowed with the final casualty numbers. They had been brought aboard not for consultation, but for witnessing. The Imperium believed that those who served a doomed world must watch its end, that the final price of loyalty or cowardice must be seen with one's own eyes. The penitents trembled as the hololithic projection of the planet rotated before them, revealing the faint outline of the capital hive now collapsing into itself. One whispered a prayer beneath his breath, though it was unclear whether it was directed to the Emperor or to the memory of the home he had failed. Voss lifted a gloved hand, halting all motion. His voice, when it rose, carried the weight of a ritual recited countless times before, its cadence as cold as void steel. By decree of the God Emperor of mankind, protector of terror, Lord of the Imperium, and guarantor of humanity's survival, let this world be cleansed. Its corruption is beyond redemption. Its people are lost, its land is poisoned, its air is cursed. No life may remain, no memory endure that could spread this blight to the stars. Hadriel bowed his head slightly. Your word is sufficient, Inquisitor. Then let the final sanction commence. The execution of Exterminatus does not resemble the fury of battle. It is slow, methodical, and terribly calm, like the final breath drawn by a patient long since condemned. The weapon decks awakened first, their status runes shifting from amber to blood red. Cyclonic torpedoes, each the size of a city transport, were loaded into launch chambers lined with adamantine rails. Their warheads hummed with caged apocalyptic power, reactive cores tuned to trigger chain reactions within a planet's crust, igniting oceans, hurling continents apart, and turning atmosphere into a poisonous storm that could linger for centuries. Down in the torpedo bays, the crews stood motionless as the automated rites took over. Human hands were not permitted near these weapons during the sacred sequence. Servitors with lobotomized precision oversaw the rites, their mechanical limbs adjusting microscopic calibrations as litanies of destruction played from Vox grills. The ship shuddered once as internal gravitic clamps disengaged. "Launch tube 1 ready," intoned the chief augumaster. "Tube 2 ready. Tubes 3 through 5 ready. Payload integrity confirmed." "Fire on my order," Hadriel murmured, placing a hand against the cast. Lectern. But before the command could be given, a sound rose from the planet below, a signal, faint and broken, blinking across one of the abandoned Vox channels. It crackled through the bridge like a dying heartbeat. Everyone froze. Even Voss turned, eyes narrowing. The signal repeated, distorted, warped, but unmistakably human. "Help us. Anyone. Emperor preserve." Another burst of static. Not all fallen. Pockets still alive. Loyal. The penitents gasped. One dropped to his knees. Another tried to step forward, only to be held back by a silent Death Watch veteran whose gauntlet pressed gently against his shoulder. Hadriel's jaw tightened. "The surface is unsalvageable. Loyalists cannot be retrieved." "They are alive," murmured Rel, though the words were not spoken in sympathy. "A non-zero survival cluster produces unpredictable variables. Statistical contamination." Voss exhaled slowly, as though disappointed by the interruption. "Open O. Channel." "Aye," said the Vox officer, activating a narrow band relay. "Channel open." The bridge grew impossibly quiet. "This is the Inquisition," Voss said, each word a steel blade. "Identify yourselves." The reply was faint, broken by the ravaged atmosphere. "This is Corporal Tharin Holt, 117th Illyrian Guard, Loyalist Detachment. We've held out in the ruins beneath Hive Kara. Civilians with us. We still fight. We can still—" Static swallowed the remaining words. Hadriel closed his eyes for a moment, perhaps in respect. "If they have endured this long, they have endured in vain." Voss's expression did not change. "Switch off the channel." "Sir?" the Vox officer asked quietly. "Switch it off." The Vox grill clicked into silence. The last plea of a loyal son of the Imperium died unheard. "Proceed," Voss commanded. Hadriel hesitated not out of disobedience, but out of a deep, ritualistic solemnity, as though acknowledging the enormity of the act. Firing sequence begins. A tremor ran through the cruiser as the first cyclonic torpedo shot into the void, leaving behind a trail of shimmering distortion. 2 more followed, then 3, then 4. Each torpedo descended toward the planet with a gravity that felt mythic. From orbit, they were streaks of pale fire, but as they breached the upper atmosphere, they became falling stars, their trajectories carving lines of judgment across the sky. For a moment, the world below seemed to hold still, as though Illyria 7 recognized the finality descending upon it. Then the surface bloomed. The first detonation tore open the crust beneath the capital hive, ripping a wound hundreds of kilometers wide. Oceans evaporated into superheated steam. Mountain ranges buckled like wet parchment. A second torpedo struck the northern hemisphere, unleashing a chain reaction of molten shockwaves that wrapped around the planet like hungry serpents. The atmosphere ignited. Winds, beyond hurricane force, scoured continents clean of stone and flesh alike. Cities were peeled apart down to their foundations. Caverns collapsed. Infrastructure dissolved. Every living creature, whether heretic, loyalist, or lost child hiding beneath broken ferrocrete, vanished in an instant of merciful blindness. From the bridge, none of the screams were heard. There was only light. A terrible, radiant halo engulfed the entire world, turning its surface into a furnace that pulsed brighter than any sunrise. The officers shielded their eyes as the planet cracked visibly, fragments shearing off and spiraling into the void. Ash geysers erupted into orbit, glimmering like spectral banners in the darkness. Minutes stretched into an eternity. When at last the light dimmed, Illyria 7 was no longer a world. It was an expanding field of debris, a drifting graveyard of molten rock and vaporized history. The fleet maintained formation, honoring the silent ritual of observation. Only when the final seismic readings flatlined did Magos Rel bow his hooded head. "Exterminatus complete," he announced. No biosigns remain. The penitents collapsed, sobbing or staring hollow-eyed at the hololith where their home had once turned beneath stars. Some would never speak again. Others would dedicate their remaining years to service aboard the Inquisition's vessels, scrubbing decks or copying data slates until their minds finally broke. Their punishment, like their survival, was deliberate. Hadriel stepped back from the lectern, exhaling a breath that steamed faintly in the cool air. "The Imperium is safeguarded," he said, though his voice carried no triumph, only burden. Voss finally turned from the viewport. "Prepare the fleet to depart. There are other worlds in need of vigilance." As he strode toward the exit, he paused beside the penitents, studying their shattered expressions. For a moment, a flicker of humanity might have passed behind his eyes, or perhaps it was only the reflection of dying embers in the hololith glow. "Remember what you witnessed," he said quietly. "Rebellion does not end in glory, it ends in silence." And with that, he stepped into the corridor, leaving the bridge consumed by the echo of a dead world. Behind him, the void closed around the fleet as the ships turned away, their engines flaring like distant candles drifting into the dark. No monument would mark the place where Illyria 7 once hung. No scholar would document its fall. No Vox transmission would ever mention its name again. It had been excised from maps, from memory, from existence. In the Imperium of Man, this was not cruelty. It was procedure. It was survival. It was the unquestioned, unrelenting truth. When a planet rebels, its story ends in fire.